Hello and welcome to the Soul Shaking Love podcast. I'm your host, Valerie Green from CoachValerieGreen.com. And this podcast is dedicated to bringing you the world's expert teachers on how to create a mind, body, and spirit connection, both with yourself and with your true love. And so today I'm really excited to be interviewing Dr. Anthony Mazzella. Hi, Anthony.
Hi, Valerie.
It's just we were really passionate about this topic because basically Anthony is a psychoanalyst and psychotherapist who specializes in psychodynamic treatment for individuals and couples, specializing in personality disorders, including narcissism and borderline personality, among others. And so I thought it would be amazing if we can talk about just narcissism in general and whether a narcissist is capable of changing. How do you know if you're with one, or even if you might be on the spectrum yourself? And what are the steps of changing? What's even possible to be more empathic, to be more present, to have a healthy relationship? Because most of the advice that is given around narcissism is if you discover that you're with a narcissist, to leave.
Yes.
And that might be good advice, right? I mean, we can even start there, right? But like the purpose of the interview is like that might be the advice, the good advice, but then what are the steps in discovering whether you can make it work before you leave? And then it's really difficult to leave. So if we do get to that, there's basically two parts to this interview. And if we get to both, great. If not, then people can tell us if they want us to get to the second part, which is why is it so hard to leave, and how do you leave, and how do you heal after you leave? Because those are really important topics too. But today we're planning on focusing on what is narcissism and what change is possible.
Yeah. Well, first, let me just say thank you very much, Valerie, for having me here and giving me this opportunity to share just some of my thoughts on what's a really complicated, topic, right? Diagnosis. So there's a lot here. And I think a good place to start is maybe just descriptively, like, how do I know if the person that I'm with, whether it's a partner, a parent, a sibling, a colleague, how do I know if I'm with somebody who has these narcissistic characteristics? And I like to describe it that way because I think, as you mentioned, it's on a spectrum. So it's, it can range all the way from people who have some of these narcissistic traits all the way up to somebody who's formally diagnosed with like NPD, which is a personality disorder. But one of the main defining characteristics in my field is what we call the grandiose sense of self. And that's just basically when someone has a belief, like a firm conviction of their own superiority. Like they really believe that they are above everybody else, that they're special, that they deserve special treatment. These are the people who feel like they shouldn't have to wait online, for instance, because only fools wait online. And why would they do that? So they tend, when there's this grandiose structure, they tend to over exaggerate their accomplishments, and they have intense fantasies about success, things that they could achieve. But we all have fantasies of success, but that are way beyond their capabilities. Like these are fantasies that are not reasonable. Now, paradoxically, this also goes along with the grandiose sense of self. So again, if you're with somebody or you recognize this, it's one of those maybe descriptive qualifiers, which is they also have bouts of insecurity and inferiority, which seems really strange because on the one hand, they seem so superior and above everybody. But then on the other hand, when there's some sort of crack in that armor, right, they have these bouts of insecurity, and they need to get rid of those as quickly as possible because they're so objectionable. So you see them oscillating, then they go back up to then the grandiose position, which may just mean, by the way, being critical of you or putting you down in some way. Right. And this speaks to the other criteria, which is, as you could imagine, if they're if they have this deep insecurity, they also have very precarious self-esteem. And that's a
Mhm.
whole nother way to define narcissism, is that the whole grandiose sense of self is a defense against this this deep feeling of inferiority. So they have the grandiose sense of self. They have these bouts of insecurity. They have fragile self esteem. And it's so fragile that even if you offer, I don't even want to say a criticism because it doesn't even have to be a criticism. It could be any kind of feedback on something that maybe needs improvement. But what
Mhm.
you'll quickly find is an intense level of defensiveness. They'll go into long explanations in terms of why they did something the way that they did, or they'll attack you. So, as you can imagine, all this leads to the final thing that I want to mention in terms if you're just trying to identify this, is they have problems with intimacy. Many of these people could be successful at work. Some of them are even CEOs or leaders in major nations, right? But they all have problems with intimacy. And they have problems because, in part, relationships are one sided. In other words, they're always looking for the recognition, the admiration, the attention, or to be taken care of in some way, depending on the type of narcissism. But all of this leads to then interpersonal struggles, which cuts across different areas of their life when they try to get close to anybody, if they can get close. So maybe let me just pause there for a moment and see if any of this is resonating. Does this sound familiar to you, Valerie? Or
Oh, yes, absolutely.
yeah.
I've studied a lot about narcissism myself just because it's
Mhm.
part of my job as a relationship coach to help
Yeah.
people to tell in the beginning if they have these red flags. And that's why I know it is a spectrum and there's 13 characteristics that define it.
Hmm.
But, I completely agree you listed the major ones. Um,
Yeah. So, and what happens, just so you mentioned, like the spectrum, that part is really important because the stronger the grandiose sense of self, typically the higher functioning person this is. So even somebody with narcissism can function at a pretty high level because that grandiosity holds them in place. But for those who are on the lower end of the spectrum, what happens is the grandiosity is weaker, so they're more fragile, in other words. And these are the people that you see oscillating more. And just to follow this through, these are the people who get a little bit closer to what we call borderline personality disorder, where you see more of that splitting and emotional dysregulation. It's not to say that people with narcissism don't become emotionally dysregulated, but the firmer the grandiose sense of self is just less likely because you could say something that's upsetting to them, and if that grandiose structure is in place, they just dismiss it. Like you don't mean anything to them anyway. Your opinion or your feedback is irrelevant because you're stupid or.
right.
So
Although you can
yeah.
feel the contempt even if they're ignoring you, and
Oh yes.
that is abuse, but you can feel the contempt.
Yeah, absolutely. Because then that wall goes up, which we call like the impenetrable stone wall, and then they kind of cut you off at that point. So it's kind of an abandonment as well, which is really difficult, to be in a relationship with somebody like that who can easily just cut you off emotionally, that is.
Right.
Yeah.
No, exactly. And I mean, one of the key factors, as I understand, is because of that. And I think, what I've heard, I actually really love the book. I forgot the author, but it's called The Wizard of Oz and Other Narcissists.
Mm.
You're familiar with that one?
I had an interview recently and somebody mentioned this. So I haven't read it, but I heard of it. Yeah. But what
Mhm.
would you think? What part of the book was resonating with you?
Yeah, so they make a distinction between an overt narcissist and a covert narcissist, which I think is what you're talking about. Overt narcissists own the grandiosity. So
Yes.
they need validation that they're the best. And if they get validation that they're the best, then they're generous and helpful. But
Hmm.
even if you try to help, if you give them advice, they'll think you're telling them they're stupid and
Yes.
they'll rail against you or dismiss you or you'll get the contempt. So that's the overt. The covert, as that book describes it, is where they actually do have low self-esteem and they have a victim story. Everyone's always out to get me. But the grandiosity is for a cause. Like they become activists or they work
Mm,
for nonprofits because they're like, I used to be an animal rights activist in college, and I knew a lot of people like this where they're like, people suck. Animals deserve to be,
mm,
fought for. I don't care about people. I'm going to be mean
yeah,
to people. Animals deserve to be, because it's caused by developmental wounding at a very young age, where people weren't safe to be around and animals were for them.
that's right. Yeah.
And so
And an
it's
animal can give
very,
you what? They say this about animals, but they give you unconditional love, right? Where a human can really get upset with you when you do something to them. So the covert, yeah, that's like a whole nother presentation of narcissism. But just to give a sense, now you made me think of something else. So on the one hand, just if we go to the extremes, you have the grandiose narcissist. That's like your prototypical narcissist that people think of. And all the way on the other extreme, you have something called the vulnerable narcissist. And it's
mhm.
not like somebody is one or the other. I like to use this example of Tony Soprano. I don't know if you watched The Sopranos many years ago, but this was a guy who fell more in the category of the grandiose narcissist, maybe even malignant, which is a whole nother category. But then there was a point in the show when he left, his wife kicked him out basically. And there was a separation, which is a big deal with narcissists because they do not tolerate separation very well. And he was living at his mother's house, right? She wasn't there. But suddenly what you saw is he's on the phone late at night with other members of the mafia and he can't get off. Like he wants to just keep talking. And it's late and they're tired and you could see they want to get off the phone, but he needs them there, right? And that's more the vulnerable presentation. So if you're thinking about whether you yourself struggle with these characteristics or you're in a relationship with somebody, that stuff is important to pay attention to as well, which is the whole vulnerable presentation. These are the people who present just the opposite of the grandiose. Instead of overtly outgoing, they're overtly insecure, helpless, needy. These are the kind of people who are always complaining about something, and they have this attitude that they need to be taken care of, that they can't do it on their own. So that's a whole nother segment of
Right.
narcissism, but nevertheless still narcissism because why? They still get that attention. They still get that caring, which is what they need to bolster their sense of self, right? Which is fragmented. So what holds them together is not the grandiose structure. What actually holds them together is the feeling that somebody's there taking care of them and that they really love them.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'll talk more about vulnerability. We're swapping interviews. So I'm talking
Mhm.
about healing codependence. And
Mm,
um, so what
yes.
I'm hearing about what you're saying is that the kind of vulnerability of a vulnerable narcissist, which I think is similar to a covert narcissist, is a victim story. I
Hmm.
was hurt, so I deserve to be taken care of. And there is an empowered vulnerability of healthy interdependence.
Hmm.
I'm sad, but I'm solution focused. I'm sad. I'm looking for somebody to help me figure out what
Yeah.
I need so I can move forward. So I just want to, we can put a bookmark there because we'll talk about.
Yes. I'm excited to hear about this. Absolutely.
But yeah, no, and of course you can talk more about it too because this is I'm picking your brain.
Well,
But
because codependency, to your point, it's such a big part of narcissism. And when we go a little bit further, as you and I are chatting, at some point we have to talk about relationships, right? And how people get caught in these relationships. You mentioned it a moment ago, right? But there's the codependency right there. That's a big part of how they end up getting caught up in these relationships and why they can't get out.
mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we'll talk more about that with the codependent part. But what I wanted to say is, I'm validating that the kind of vulnerability that a narcissist will have will be a victim story.
Well, yes. Can I just add one thing to that, though? So with the covert narcissist, the one that you mentioned earlier, that's the presentation, that they're the victim and that you've done something to them, right?
Right.
That somehow you've wronged them. With the vulnerable narcissist, you don't hear the victim as much, but you hear the needy cry to be taken care of. So
Mhm.
depending on the cluster, if we could say that, because remember, they're not mutually exclusive. There are some of these characteristics and traits in all different types of narcissism, but predominantly, what you're talking about, the victimhood, that's at the essence, like sort of the core of the covert narcissist, that they're always wronged and you need to apologize, and you end up feeling guilty when you're around them, like you did something so devastating that you've harmed them in some way, but it's
Mhm.
so subtle, and that's the part of the manipulation, and it's so hard to detect as well.
No, exactly. And I think it's important to recognize that that same humbleness is not coming back towards you,
Hmm. Yeah.
which is hard to see if we're codependent. But I'm laughing, but I mean, I am actually still healing the vestiges of my own codependence, which I'll talk about in my interview.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
But so I'm laughing, but because I get amused at my own limitations as well. But it's not a
Mm.
funny dynamic; it's a serious dynamic.
Yes.
Um, but there's one more thing that I wanted to ask you about
Hmm.
in terms of defining narcissism, and then of course I want to go into like what are the painful cycles that we get caught in when we're with
Okay.
a narcissist. But the thing I really want to focus on is why is it incapable for them to have empathy? Because I think that's one of the main, they can fake empathy, but in order to have real empathy, you need to recognize that the other person has different feelings and different needs than you.
That's
And
right.
because
That's
their
it. That's it. You said
personality,
it. No,
right.
Valerie, you just said it right there. That's the essence of it right there. Because there is this lack of what we call self-other differentiation, relationships tend to be merged. There's the codependency. So to have true empathy, you have to be able to step into somebody else's experience. In other words, you have to be curious about what their experience was like. But to do that implies what? That they're a separate person, right? With their own life, with their own thoughts and feelings different than yours. And that's threatening. That's very threatening. And I'll go into that more when we talk about the cycles. But
Mm-hmm.
that's one of the reasons why it's so hard to have empathy, because they have these shallow relationships with people that never allow the person to be separate from them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Exactly. I think that's the main um dynamic that causes all the painful cycles. So yeah, that's why I wanted to bring that up. But of course, now we can talk about what are the painful cycles that people get caught in relationships with a narcissist, and so that we might be able to identify those and see
Yes.
if indeed that's where we're at, or if that's where someone we know is at.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to just be transparent with you and your audience. So my response to this question is going to be from a psychodynamic perspective, okay?
Mhm.
So to answer this question, when we think about these painful cycles, I think we need to consider, where do relationships, when you're in a narcissistic relationship, if you're in a relationship with somebody who you think may have these characteristics, where does that relationship primarily exist? Primarily, it exists in fantasy. And what that means is that there's always this fantasy that there's this hope, right? That things will be different in the future. So at its core, the fantasy is about, remember I mentioned the grandiose sense of self a little bit earlier, but that sense of self is kind of meaningless unless it's merged with, this is what we were just talking about, an idealized other. And that's what makes a blissful union right there.
Mhm.
So the grandiose sense of self is, I have a need, like not to wait in line, for example, and the idealized other is the person who's supposed to be there immediately to gratify that need. So there's your blissful union and your lack of separation and individuation in this relationship. But this exists primarily in fantasy, as you can imagine, because nobody is always present to meet your need, and that's when things begin to crack a little bit. But it's about this. The main goal with the in the relationship is the blissful, undisturbed symbiotic union, right? Because we know that there's been childhood trauma, and this is the stuff that went missing very early in life. Either it was ruptured prematurely, or too quickly, or too consistently. So they never had that feeling of somebody really being there for them to contain them. The empathy that you mentioned earlier, what we call affective resonance, to really understand them. So part of what goes on in these relationships is they're always looking for somebody, or expecting somebody is going, or hoping that somebody's finally going to recognize them in a way that they've never been recognized before. So that's just sort of the foundation, unfortunately, sadly, of these relationships. And it's so compelling. I have to tell you that even when you may notice it, or you have friends or family members maybe who say to you that this relationship is very toxic, or you need to leave, back to your point where you started way at the very beginning. Remember, the number one advice is you need to leave these relationships.
Right.
It's not that simple. That's like such superficial advice. That's advice for someone who doesn't really appreciate how compelling this fantasy is, and how it sustains them, and the hope sustains them. It's like asking someone to give up their left arm. It really is, because that's the merged experience. So
Mm-hmm.
that's the foundation of the relationship, and
Right.
in part why it's difficult. Yeah, go ahead. Please jump in, please.
Oh no, I mean, I'm just validating you, but
Mhm.
it is, when we're in a relationship with somebody where we have, and I feel compassion for people that are on the NPD spectrum, because they're literally not aware that they're idealizing the other person and
Mhm.
expecting them. It's all these
That's
unconscious
right.
expectations. They feel like that they're out of control with it when someone points that out, because it occurs to them as obvious, like I deserve this and the other person should be giving it to me. It's like a given. And the
Mhm.
thing is, like, if they don't get it, they fly into this rage because it challenges the mask that they had to build up to hide the shame when they were little.
Yes.
And
Yep.
it's really, it's a they can't help it, is what I wanted to say.
Yeah, no, and this is such a good point you're raising, and I'm glad you said it. It's unconscious. It's not intentional. And unfortunately, like, not unfortunately, but what's emerging in the literature is what they call what do they the it's called the shared unconscious fantasy. So it's a shared fantasy between two people who come together. And that's where it gets very complicated, Valerie, because if you listen to social media, more often than not, it's always the narcissistic husband or narcissistic wife's fault,
Right.
and they want to blame somebody. And that's really easy and comfortable and reassuring to think that this didn't have anything to do with me. This was about how poorly they treated me. But it's called a shared unconscious fantasy because it's two people who come together who both have this fantasy that the other person is going to fulfill them. And by the way, that's where you come in because, and we'll get into this, I know, in the second in the next interview, but that's the codependency, right?
Exactly.
Because I'm sure there are many different ways to define it, but in part, what's codependency? It's when somebody's self-worth is dependent upon external what? Validation or recognition of you. And that's what makes it so hard to leave these relationships because if that's what's holding you together now, just waiting and hoping, and you do get this along the way, right? Because they have these moments of blissful togetherness when things are great, you know. That's why you always have to be careful when you're talking to somebody like this and they say, we had an amazing weekend, things were great. You have to be suspicious of that. Like, why amazing? Like, why not a good weekend? But anyway, that goes back to the splitting, which, is another story. But
Yes.
yeah, the codependency, the enmeshment, all of this is what goes on in these relationships and makes it incredibly difficult to leave.
Mhm. No, exactly. And I'm glad that you're saying that because it still might be the best thing to do to leave, but it's a question of how. And so let's continue really just bottom lining what are these painful cycles, because you know, maybe a case study or an example so that people can identify themselves. And then we can talk about how have you helped narcissists to recognize.
Okay.
Like
Yeah.
I did listen to a story in your podcast, for example, where you
Hmm.
talk about how you worked with a narcissist, and even just getting him to recognize that he was using you as kind of like an encyclopedia.
Oh,
It was like
okay.
really
Yes.
shameful for him to even realize. But once you helped him realize that that's what he was doing, then he could be more self-aware that you're a
Hmm.
person. And so, you know, it's like that's one of the things that I think is good to talk about. But first, let's bottom line, like, what is, you know, what's the consequences? Like, if I'm codependent and I share something that I need, all of a sudden they fly into a rage and then we're in a painful cycle. And, you know, why is that so difficult? And, you know, what does it mean that we're always beating our head against a wall, which is what people usually tell me.
Yeah, this is so interesting because the cycle I think you're probably familiar with, and anybody who listens to social media looks at this sort of pattern that goes on with, they call it like love bombing. You know, there's this idealized state, everything is blissful, and then comes the devaluing stage, and then the hoovering.
Mm-hmm.
And that's okay. I mean, it's general enough that most people can resonate with something like that. But the main thing I want to make clear, and you just did it by the way, Valerie, and we did it a little bit earlier, but this is so important. It's worth repeating. Like review is good. Someone doesn't go from like the loving idealized stage to the devaluing just one day when they woke up and they decide to devalue you. But most people don't recognize this because they don't get really close to these people and follow the really subtle nuances of what happens. And to do that, you have to slow them down. You have to get them into a regulated state of mind. And 99% of the time, what you hear is there was a separation of some sort. Again, a separation can be anything like you just described. It could even just be a different opinion on something, believe it or not. It's as subtle as that.
Right.
So it could be the end of a honeymoon weekend where they're both coming home and you pick up a phone call or you respond to a text when you're in the car. And they're like, oh, you're going right back. You're leaving me. You know, we're still on vacation. I don't. But you see, these things are very subtle. But that's what typically leads to the sort of the puncture in the blissful union that happens, which is what they need, right? And because that sort of disavows any kind of loss or separation. So now they're faced with a separation, which is intolerable. They don't know how to manage separations because they've been traumatized by this early in life, which we could talk about, like where this comes from. I don't know if we want to go into that, but this is what causes it is early trauma that has not yet been worked through. So they don't learn how to tolerate separation aside from trying to control you, right? Or control the other person and or withdrawing. You know, that's the block that goes up that you and I mentioned a little bit earlier. That's the whole grandiose structure, which is great for dealing with loss because now again, nothing matters. There's a dismissive attitude. So, and that's why it's a cycle because what happens is there's no real working through of a loss. There's usually not even a recognition of it because they're so busy blaming one another in these relationships.
Right.
And then things just go back, seemingly to being okay, but they don't understand why things went off the rails in the first place or why things are better now. It's just like things are just better when we're talking again. And then before you know it, things are great and wonderful. And that's when they're in trouble because when things are great and wonderful, like we said before, that's a red flag.
Well, right. It's things are great and wonderful when we're meeting all their needs and
Exactly.
bending over
Yeah.
backwards to proactively guess what they need and attune to them and always be there for them.
And it's wonderful
But
for you too, but just so you know, that's the shared fantasy. It's wonderful for you too when you're meeting their needs. Why? Because it's like you're mothering, you're being there for somebody in a way that's a narcissistic boost for you too, because it feels really good to, I don't know, be there, cook a meal, be so responsive, and then be recognized. You see, that's what you get back is the
Mhm.
recognition and appreciation. The thing that you think that you really need, that's going to make everything better in you. But of course it doesn't, because that's not what you really need.
Right, exactly. And that's, yeah, we'll talk about more about that with the
Mhm.
codependence because um, what we really need is that deep emotional connection going
Exactly.
forward.
Yes. Yep.
But if we're either a narcissist or codependent, we don't recognize that need.
Yep.
So, so let's talk about then what are the ways that they're capable of changing. Because I'll talk about how to heal codependence in my interview, but you're more familiar with what are the ways that a narcissist can change. So that's really what I want to ask you about.
So I don't want to be overly schematic, but let's say there are four things that come to my mind with this question, okay? So the first thing is when we think about change, like we have to ask ourselves, like, how do we define change? Like, what does change look like? So that's always, I think, a good place to start because you always hear they don't change. And it's like, well, they do change, maybe not in a way that you're thinking. So let's start with that because true change, what you and I are discussing now, not just like adjusting, like we were just describing, like being there to meet somebody's needs after a fight. That's like making a quick adjustment.
Right.
That's like a honeymoon phase. But true change requires deep work. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean you need to be in psychoanalytic therapy, right? Like 4 times a week. Of course, that might be ideal, but not everybody could do that or is interested. But through listening to the work that you and I do, listening to our podcast, reading, studying this stuff, being open-minded, all of that is part of what I would call doing the emotional work. Okay. So I'm just going to go over like the four that I think are most important criteria for change. First they have to have the ability to recognize that there's a problem, right? In other words, not that it's just your problem, Valerie, or whoever, right? That it's not
Right.
somebody, but that in some way, inadvertently, that they may have actually contributed to this problem, whatever the problem may be, whether it's a fight, an argument, right? So that's the first thing is they have to have this ability. And that's no easy task because with the grandiose structure, the thing, that structure that I mentioned earlier, it does no wrong. You see, it's perfect. So they tend to externalize any problem. So everything good is in me, and usually everything bad, when things go bad, is in somebody else. So
Right.
that's a big
That's their
step.
belief. I mean, I just want to, that
Yeah, tell
goes
me, say it
without
again. I'm
saying,
sorry.
but that goes without saying, but I just want to hone in on it. Like that's their belief. But obviously
Yes.
the truth, but that's how they think. They think there's nothing wrong with me. I could do no wrong. The problem is always with the other person. So what I'm hearing in this first characteristic
Mm-hmm.
of knowing if they can change is, are they self-aware enough to take a little bit of responsibility? Like,
Yes.
I'm taking
Exactly.
responsibility for the impact.
Yep.
Even if it's just 1%, I did something that was, because I don't even look at right versus wrong. I look at values judgments. It's like, my action caused you pain.
Yes.
Can I
So funny you said 1%, right?
responsibility for that? Right.
I like that you said 1% because I literally hear this when I'm working with couples. And the husband may say to the wife, can you not take any responsibility at all? Like, is it 100% my responsibility all the time? It's always all my fault. Like, not even 1% is your fault. So it's funny you mention that because people think in this way, like, how is it possible that 100% of the time it's always my problem in something that I did? So that's a good place to start. When thinking of is change possible? Can they take even 1% of the responsibility for something that went wrong? Right. And then along with that is if they can, let's say they take some percentage, the next step is can they seriously take your feelings into consideration? Like, let's say, for example, a lot of times people come to me after there's an affair in the relationship. So now they have to begin a process of developing trust again. And let's just say it's the guy who cheats on the wife. He's going out with his friends and she says she's getting anxious. Can he say something like, listen, no problem. I'm going out with my friends, but I'll check in with you through the night. I'll call you or I'll send you pictures. It sounds like it's controlling. And some people can't do this because they're like, oh, now she's just trying to control me, right? It's kind of like, can I look at your phone? In other words, can you turn over your phone to somebody for them to look at as you're trying to repair the damage? Now, if you have genuine concern, right? If you can acknowledge and take responsibility for somebody else's feelings, which is really, really a big step. It's hard, but this is part of what you would see if they're on their way to change. They say, take my phone. No, no worries. I have nothing to hide. And if that's going to make you feel better, I want you to feel better. I want you to begin to trust me. So take my phone. So that's one of the criteria. Okay. So
Right.
this,
Yeah. And
yeah,
I mean, I want to pause you there just because,
please.
I mean, first of all, I just want to caveat what I said. Obviously, I do believe in right and wrong, and some,
Mhm.
right. But what I'm talking about in, relationship dynamics, it's more about feelings and needs and values judgments rather than moralistic judgments. So I just wanted to caveat
Yes.
that. But what
Okay.
you just said, I think is really important. And I wanted to kind of hone in on it. That if a narcissist, um, is capable of recognizing that the other person's feeling is separate and
Hmm.
caring. And because I'm going to talk about this more in my interview, that true interdependence, it doesn't mean that if the other person says, give me your, I want to be able to look at your phone, that the person would be like, yes, right away. It's a collaboration. It's,
Hmm.
I recognize that what would that provide for you? You need to feel safe. I want to help you to feel safe. This is one strategy. There might be other strategies besides looking at my phone, but they're
That's right.
going to be willing to consider what the other person needs to feel safe rather than just having this ideal fantasy of you should just feel safe because that's your job.
Yep. Yep, exactly. I like the word collaboration too. That's such an important piece of it because you may not be comfortable handing over your phone, but you're willing to talk to your significant other and say, this is not what works for me. But let's not give up on this because I still want you to feel comfortable. What else can I do to prove, that I'm not still whatever
Right. And
looking
they
for
would be
positive?
able to get vulnerable about why. Like it's a nice idea to look at my phone, but I'm uncomfortable with it because it's my work phone and
Mhm.
my colleagues I need to be on call all the time and I
Yes.
might miss something. But how about you look at my computer or whatever? You know what I mean? Like they're going to be more willing to work with you to find strategies that work with both of you rather than my way or the highway.
Yes. And by the way, just so you know, this is like, if we call it criteria, like number two, right? The capacity for emotional depth, right? Before I mention that they tend to be shallow in their relationships. But what you're describing now is that they're able to tolerate painful feelings either in themselves, they have their own reasons why they may not be able to do whatever it is, shame, humiliation, insecurity, whatever reason, but also the emotions of somebody else, that there really is a need in this other person and that's okay because they want to build trust with them. So now this all requires tolerating painful feelings both within yourself and within somebody else. And that's not easy again, because it's much easier just to go back to a word we used earlier, the love bombing, right? The idealized relationship where, no, you don't need to look at my phone. Everything is great. We're going out. Aren't you having fun with me? Don't you trust me? We just went to this party or whatever. I mean, you could fill in the blank, but
Right.
that's all the love bombing, all of that. That's part of if they go back to that or they go into a rage, by the way, right? The corollary of love bombing, but still the same thing. It takes them out of the experience of the moment and being with the other person. And
Right.
that's not a good sign, right? That they're really genuinely interested in change. Yeah.
Right. No, exactly. And that's hard. That's why I think, if you're recognizing that you might have some of these 13 characteristics, it's easy to Google what they are, that it can be really hard to change on your own. That's why, Anthony, Dr. Mozilla focuses on working with people who have personality disorders, because when we start to, like I said, I'm still healing my own codependence, which is overlapping healing, because codependents don't know how to give empathy to their deeper emotions either. They're also caught in the fantasy.
Yes.
And so when we start to learn how to give ourselves empathy and compassion for our own feelings, usually what comes up is so much grief from our childhood, that from coming from the wounding that we didn't get that need met when we actually needed it the most when we were little. And so if that comes up and you don't know how to handle it, it is important to work with a professional.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one advantage if you do work with if you could do this, and this is, I guess, another criteria now that you mentioned it, is the effort has to be consistent and sustained over time, because if they have these traits, and even if it's like full blown, it's a personality disorder, that implies that it's deeply ingrained in their personality, and it affects many different areas of life. So change doesn't happen overnight, and that's something else that needs to be considered, because sometimes I get these calls and people want to change and they're very committed. And then I ask them, what do you think is going to be necessary? Like, how long do you think you'll be talking to me? And they're like, I don't know, maybe a couple of months. And I say, I think maybe you'll get some relief in a couple of months, but that's like barely scratching the surface. So that's the other thing. There's not just that they're motivated to change, but that there has to be, I guess, a willingness for the consistency of doing the work, and whatever the work is, whether it's with a trained, therapist, or with you, Valerie, but that it has to be consistent and done over time. And the grandiose sense of self, or the vulnerability, the things I mentioned earlier, are all what we call structures that develop in the mind. The illusion that I'm perfect, you can imagine like how powerful that is.
Mm-hmm.
So that stuff takes time to undo. Structures are a process with a slow rate of change, which not everybody can tolerate, but usually after 6 months of good treatment, 6 to 9 months, you really start to see pretty significant changes, enough that they start to feel, or their relationships, they may not start to feel better, by the way, because they're losing that grandiose structure, which is what
Right.
held them together. So that's really important to note. It's not like therapy or doing this work is going to be easy, because then you're faced with confronting a painful reality, right?
Right.
Or painful feelings, like you just mentioned, deep from childhood that you may not have ever dealt with before. So that's another criteria, which is the sustained work. Yeah.
Right. No, that makes sense. So, like, let's go over these four criteria again: the taking responsibility, even if it's just 1%.
Yes.
Um, and
1%. I like that.
meaning even just acknowledging like this other person has separate emotions and separate thoughts and separate beliefs, and that's
That's
okay.
the emotional depth. Yep. So that's
Right.
the like that's what we call emotional depth, right?
Mhm.
Somebody else, I have deeper feelings and somebody else has deeper feelings. Yes.
Right. No, exactly. And that they're able to recognize the other person as separate, right? That's
Yep.
kind of like, and
Yes.
have a little bit of empathy for the other person's feelings. That's the second thing you mentioned. And then the fourth is the capability of um, um, being able to do
Yes.
sustained work over time.
Yes. Yep.
Laughing just because of me being difficult to find the words, but
No, it's just sustained. That's it. You got the word. It's just the continuity of keeping after this, recognizing, as painful as it is, that change doesn't happen quickly. When the more of these traits that you have, right, the longer it's going to take. Or for someone who's in this kind of relationship, right, the longer it's going to take to mourn and get over that. Yeah.
No, exactly. It's not a simple personality disorders are not a simple thing to grapple with.
Yep.
It
Yeah.
is, the entire personality structure is based on these limiting beliefs and masks, and
Hmm.
it's painful to remove them, and the person doesn't feel better as they're being removed.
Because they're adaptive, this is what they learn. This is, believe it or not, this is how they survived. And if you think about it this way, you mentioned this earlier as well about having compassion for these people. And one way to have compassion is to understand that they needed to survive. Everybody needs to feel recognized or validated to survive. Just if I could digress just for one moment, you may have seen this research experiment. It's on YouTube. It's so fascinating. It's by it's called the still face experiment, and
Mhm.
they have children, infants, with
Yep.
their caregiver, and the researcher instructs the caregiver just to give the developing child a still face. So they videotape this, and what they show is the caregiver playing with the child. The child is happy, smiling, cooing, pointing, and then they put a still face on, which is just like having a parent who's not emotionally available, right? Andre Green calls this the dead mother, right? There's a whole psychoanalytic concept for this, but it's someone who's not affectively alive and attuned to you. Within seconds, Valerie, maybe you've seen this, within seconds, you could see the discomfort on the infant's face. They try to re-engage their parent, but the parent, stays with the still face. They start banging on the table, right? That's like your angry narcissist, by the way. Then they look away. So there's the dismissiveness, like, I don't need you. And slowly, within 90 seconds, right? Like maybe a 60 to 90 seconds, you could see them completely collapse. It's actually heartbreaking to watch it.
It
But if
is.
you think of someone who's completely collapsing, how important then the whole grandiose narcissistic need for affirmation and recognition becomes. It really was adaptive. So yeah, it's defensive, it's true. And I know it's maladaptive when it comes to relationships, but it was adaptive in learning to survive. And that's what they know. And that's all they know.
Yeah.
So yeah, yeah.
I appreciate you saying that, because and when I say I have compassion, that's why, because
Mhm.
as a coach, coaching is more about teaching skills and helping just do the cognitive work and teaching skills. I also do some healing, so it's therapy is deeper in the healing perspective.
Mhm.
But
Yeah.
regardless, like, um, I know what it takes to change, and I have a lot of compassion for how challenging it is for somebody who has these personality structures. Not that that means that I would, cross my own boundaries, or
Mhm.
tolerate behavior that doesn't work for me just because I have
Mhm.
compassion. Um, but
Right.
I think that it's important to be able to have compassion enough to recognize, I'm curious, does the person I know have these four characteristics that you mentioned that allow change to happen?
Right.
And if you notice that they do, the question is, how might you be able to influence them to seek help?
If you notice that they have this capacity, you mean like they meet the criteria you're saying, right? So it's a positive prognostic sign at that moment.
Yeah.
Um, that's going to be tough because if they're actually hitting these markers, what's the incentive to go get help?
Mm-hmm.
Right? I would be more inclined if they're struggling. Like if you notice within them and your partner or whomever, or yourself, by the way, are prone to return to that shared fantasy, that shared unconscious fantasy where things are just amazing and you see these cycles of idealization and then the devaluation, loss is difficult. Then you could say, yes, maybe, look, we tried and we put up a good effort and we got so far, but maybe now it's time for professional assistance. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, no, exactly. And I mean, I'll talk about this too when I talk about healing codependence, but if a codependent is in relationship with a narcissist who they think might be capable of change, it's really about the codependent doing their inner work to be vulnerable to themselves and recognizing what they need and being able to spell that out. Here's what I need. Here's what it would provide for me. And
Hmm.
having healthy boundaries. These are the boundaries I need to set. This is what I'm comfortable giving. This is what I'm not comfortable giving. And
Yes.
set those limits. and that I want to be with you, but I can't be with you unless these things change. And to be able to tolerate the potential rage that can come and stay true to your boundaries in a loving, compassionate, empathic way, which is really, really hard because what that requires is to heal codependence before we can do that. And so, of course, that's what I'll talk about in our interview of me.
Yeah. It's interesting because when you just talked it out, you made me think about when you asked, like, how can you talk to somebody about getting help? And one way I thought now, which I didn't think of before, is to couch it as not that this is your problem, right? Like that I need you to do this because once you do that, you're pathologizing them.
Right.
I would try to couch it more like, do you think this is a problem? Like I would always try to engage their curiosity and get their buy-in. And
Mm-hmm.
it wouldn't be a recommendation, you see, because once you recommend somebody to go get help, especially if someone's narcissistically vulnerable,
Yep.
they're going to feel pathologized so quickly and then they're going to push back on you.
Yep.
So the question is, can you engage their curiosity and help them begin to see that maybe they are in conflict themselves? Like, in other words, they really want to change. They recognize the relationship isn't going well, or they recognize that they have these bouts of insecurity, that they feel great one moment and the next moment they're desperately insecure. You can then talk to them about, do you think, that this is creating a problem in your life? Or how is it you manage these things? Do you think it would be helpful to have somebody manage them with you or to help you give you some tools to help you manage it? Because you really seem to be suffering when you're crying and you're in bed for like half a day when you break down. It's so painful to see you this way.
Yeah, no,
Well,
exactly.
that's one way then. Yeah. So to get their buy-in by way of helping them begin to reflect upon, right? Whether this is interfering in their relationships, their work, whatever it is where it may be interfering.
Right. No, exactly. I love what you just said because it's really about um authentically being compassionately curious. You're not trying to change them.
Yes, that's
Not
right.
you're not judging them. And what that requires is if we're codependent, codependents also can't recognize that the other person has separate feelings and needs that are okay. Like that they have a belief that if you're not okay, I'm not okay.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yes.
so it's like I need to be having self-compassion for my feelings and needs and having compassion for your feelings and needs in order to be authentically curious.
Yes. Yeah,
So
that's a high level of and it's interesting. Again, you get me thinking when you say this because oftentimes one of the things I talk about with the vulnerable narcissist is the way they're so dependent and needy and clingy. And I talk to people, and I've done this on other during other interviews, is how it's so important to contain that. In other words, don't just gratify their needs, and don't get angry with them and tell them they're pathetic and they need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, right? But then sometimes I get a little pushback, like that takes a really high level of maturity to be able to contain that. And I
mhm,
agree, it absolutely does, because if you're in a dysregulated state of mind yourself, how could you possibly feel compassion and understanding for somebody, who's in this state? But that goes back to codependency because that implies you're mixed up in it with them. There's no separation. In other words, their problem is your problem. So
right.
when they have a problem, how could you talk to them if you're dysregulated? But now, according to the codependency theory, which we need to get much further into, and I'm looking forward to this, is you may already be in a codependent relationship, and that's why you're not in a position to just be more empathic and understanding and contain their feelings. Yeah.
Right, exactly. And it has to start with being compassionate and empathic and understanding of our own feelings.
Yes.
You know,
Yeah. And
like otherwise we're just gonna get enmeshed with them drawing us into their victim story and want to help them and be people pleasing. And that is
there's a
still
big part. That's a big
right,
part of narcissism, which I didn't talk about when we were going over the descriptive criteria.
right.
But there's this inordinate need to please others as well. That you have that sort of segment or cluster of narcissism, but that too leads to a false relationship. That's the shared fantasy as well, because if you please them, again, you feel so good because then you're getting the recognition that you so desire and need. But
Hmm.
it's still not an authentic relationship, of course not. So all of this is part of what leads to change or what's necessary for change is recognizing what we could call a split world, right? There's this fantasy world, the shared unconscious fantasy, where you're striving for everything to be so blissful. That's the symbiotic union, right? That's finally feeling recognized, right? And that world is so appealing. It's like a drug. It's like an addiction. So there's that world, and then there's the real world, which sucks, by the way. It's not pleasant. People have different opinions. There are people who frustrate you, right? People who don't gratify your needs immediately. And this is the conflict is, and this is part of the work, by the way, that I do with these patients,
Mm-hmm.
is helping them show them specifically when they slip out of the real world into the fantasy world. Because again, since it's unconscious, right, Valerie, you said this earlier, which was an important point. They don't even recognize it. And if you don't recognize something, how could you possibly ever begin to work on it?
Yep.
So what I could show them slowly over time, like I'll just give you like a little example. Like if someone comes in and they're complaining about, I don't know, my husband and I had a fight over child rearing, right? That he had this different opinion and it led to this argument. If I'm able to slow that story down and show her what happened, and I'll say, listen, can we go back for a moment? I don't know if you noticed this, but you were telling me about a fight that you had with your husband, and you seemed quite uncomfortable that he had a different opinion. See, so there's the difference, right? But then you shifted and you started, and now here you could fill in the blank because some people go to fighting, like I mentioned earlier, or everything is wonderful. So I'll say, did you notice that you shifted and you started telling me what an amazing weekend you had with him, or you attacked him, or whatever, right? So the goal then is to begin to show them these minute shifts from a painful reality that your husband had a different opinion on child rearing. Because most people who are not personality disordered would be like, of course you have a different opinion. I didn't expect you to be a carbon copy of me. And let me hear your opinion. What were you thinking? But for someone who has the personality disorder, there's that separation that I mentioned earlier that's so subtle they don't even notice and so unbearable, and they slip back in order to undo it into the fantasy of like, let me just tell you about the amazing weekend we had. And then I could empathize with that and say, look, I could see how that made you feel better. It's much more pleasant to be thinking about the amazing weekend rather than the difference of opinions, right? So now then we can get her curious, hopefully, about, but is there any other way, perhaps, that you could feel better about a different opinion? Can we talk about that? So that's a small piece, because like we said, there are so many different things going on,
Yeah.
with the person. But that's one small piece in terms of how we address splitting, right? How we address the fragmented sense of self, how we help them become more integrated, and how we help them begin to realize that they exist in two separate worlds, the fantasy world and the world of reality, because they do exist in both. When these people go on, tirades about how, they're the devil and the narcissist is the worst and they'll never change. By the way, that's splitting as well, just so you know, right? Because now you're just attacking somebody and you're not looking at the complete person anymore. So the goal is integration and helping them recognize feelings that they couldn't tolerate. So some people call it expanding their self-awareness, but that's what we're doing,
Mhm.
basically.
Right.
Yeah.
No, exactly. I love that little story because I think it really emphasizes how slow the work needs to go. Because
Yes.
we slip into this, and, because codependents do it too. We slip into these
Mm-hmm.
fantasies to escape feeling
Yep.
painful feelings in the moment. And the corrective experience is learning how to have self-compassion and self-empathy for our feelings in the moment. But that's really slow work. We have to slow down in order to do that. And my guess is, because I know that it's time to end, and
Mm-hmm.
there's other things we could talk about, but
Always, always.
we'll talk about that at the end. But I really want to highlight what you just said, that my guess is that, we can bring a case study or two conglomerates into it, just
Mm,
that once people learn to slow down and actually stay present in the moment and
yes.
recognize, like, it's okay to feel this way. I can have self-compassion and empathy for my feelings. The other person is separate and they have their own feelings too.
Yes.
I can
Yeah.
honor that they're separate. Like, that's, the beginning of the healing. Have you seen people transform their relationship dynamics then, that like they can actually slowly be more authentic with each other and that they can make it work better?
Yeah, of course. I mean, when you start relating to people in the world of what we call in my field whole objects instead of part objects, in other words, people are not just there to gratify your needs, right? Yeah, the relationship changes. So the more they become aware of this, the more compassion they begin to develop. That's empathy. And everybody will say that the narcissist doesn't have a capacity for empathy, but that's not true. And they call it fake empathy. I think you even use that. Maybe initially it's fake, but I'd rather have fake empathy, by the way, than someone raging at me. I'd
Sure.
rather have them pretending that they care and at least trying to think about how I feel, when they do X or Y. But typically, if things go accordingly, if you have those criteria that they're there, they're working at it, it's long enough, a sustained effort, yeah, of course we see change. And it's not just me, by the way. I'm not just saying this anecdotally. There's good research studies out there, randomized controlled trials, which is the gold standard, that study this stuff and they look at change and they show it as well. So that's not just coming from me and in my practice in terms of what I see, but there's evidence to suggest that these people do have a capacity to change.
Yeah, and it's such a tough question, so I appreciate you covering this topic because the other things that we could cover, that we talked about that we could cover, it could take a whole separate interview. But
Yes.
because now that we know that it's possible to change, it's really hard to make the call. How do you know if the person can change, if they can be inspired to go to therapy, either individually or with you, or if it's time to leave.
Yeah.
And you've started to talk about why it's so difficult to leave, but we can
Mhm.
elaborate on that dynamic and
Yes. And what
that
happens when you do leave? And how do you begin
exactly,
to live a life separate from them? Because remember the shared unconscious fantasy. You were
exactly.
there for good reason yourself, as painful as it was. So what does life look like now that you left? And can you really move forward in life? Because some people leave, but they never really move forward.
Exactly. And so if you're in that state, then of course, Dr. Anthony Mazzella works with people that are in relationship with narcissists as well to help them figure that out. So
Yes.
um, we'll ask, when I post this interview, I'm asking in the comments, do you want me to bring Dr. Anthony Mazzella back to answer those questions in a second interview?
Mhm.
Because I think that those are very useful topics and we could definitely cover that. But regardless, while we're waiting to figure that out, I encourage everybody to reach out to Dr. Mazzella if you sense that you might either be on the NPD spectrum yourself, or if you're in a relationship with somebody who you sense
Yes.
might be, to figure out what your options even are. So
Hmm.
let's
Yes.
talk about how people can get in touch with you.
Well, great. Yeah. I mean, everything's on my website, just to keep it simple. My podcast is there, the video channel's there, any blogs that I write, articles that I've published. It's all at drmazzella.com. You'll put it below, so I won't go into the details here. But you can look me up on my website. And Valerie, if if your audience votes in favor of me coming back, I just want to say I would love to come back. I'm happy. I really enjoyed this conversation. It was so stimulating and insightful. I love your feedback, and I'm really looking forward. We're not calling it part two. We're just calling it another interview. So I just want to remind everybody we're going over to my channel next, and we're going to look at Valerie's area, right, of specialties, which is what? Codependency, right?
Yes, yes. It's one of my areas of specialty just
Hmm.
because as a coach, I love doing deep healing work. And both anxious attachment and codependency are not disorders in the DSM. They, in
Hmm.
my opinion, they're belief systems and skill sets. So, I'll talk on your channel about how I heal codependency, and I look forward to that. So, but if
Great, me too.
I
Thank you
will,
so much, Savannah.
I will put your website below the video and in the show notes if you're listening to the podcast, because I encourage everybody to reach out to Dr. Mazzella if you are feeling like you've heard this and you're motivated or confused about what your options are, whether you should stay and work on it, whether it makes sense to heal it yourself and leave. It's not an easy issue, and Dr. Mazzella is available to support people. So I encourage everybody to reach out to him with questions. And I've thoroughly enjoyed this too, because as I said in the beginning, I think that the right advice might be to leave, but I never believe in superficial advice. And so it's important
That's
to
right.
educate ourselves about what's possible and make an informed choice. And so I feel really
Yes.
grateful that you shared all this information.
Well, it was my pleasure. Thank you again, Valerie. I'll see you on my side, okay?
Yes, exactly. Until next
Okay.
time.
All right. Bye.